just got into a huge fight with my MAGA dad at a Mexican restaurant because I said that billionaires should pay their lowest employees a living wage. That's all I said. And he freaked out. He was like, well, we need billionaires to run society. Who's going to build the factories? Who's going to build the ships? We need billionaires. You can't have a world without them. I was like, all I'm saying is they need to be taxed fairly, and they need to pay their workers a living wage so that they can live a decent life. That's all I said. And kept repeating that. I was like, you are the peasant in this scenario. I had to say that to him multiple times. And he's like, yeah, that's okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. And then he talked about how the billionaires are taxed at 80%. He actually thinks that. He thinks that they are taxed at 80%. He's like, when you go to the Netherlands, there's going to be billionaires and millionaires there. And I'm like, okay. That's not even part of the point. I don't know why you're bringing that up. I don't care about them existing. I care about them paying their fair tax and paying their workers a living wage. Those were the two main points. And he totally thinks that trickle-down economics is a thing and that Reagan had it all right. And I honestly think that's why so many of the boomer people are Trump people, because he's just building on that. But I think maybe they've been brainwashed since Reagan. I really think that's how long this has been going on. And they actually think, after seeing decades go by and they are now at the end point of capitalism, they still don't get it because they're that brainwashed. It's been decades. I really think that's what's going on. It's fucking crazy.
Trump is a con man who has deceived the people who follow him blindly and who cannot escape his cult, and for whatever reason cannot bring themselves to admit they've been fooled. But I'm not without sympathy for them, because I spent many years having been fooled myself. Of course, I was a teenager at the time, and the con man who fooled me was Ronald Reagan, who was a lot better actor and a lot more clever than Trump. Nevertheless, the principle's the same. Let me explain. One of the first historical events I can remember impacting my life and that I took personally was the 1979 seizure of the American hostages by the revolutionary students in Iran. The ordeal that those people suffered was not only alarming to us and to anyone who had any empathy at all, but it was a huge blow to the American psyche. To have a country like Iran, that had once been a puppet state of ours, humiliating the United States in the way that they did, was enraging, to say the least. And everybody in my generation can remember that feeling. And we were angry at President Carter and what we saw as his weakness and the ineffectual way he had of going about the thing, and of the failure of the hostage rescue mission, absolute debacle in the desert. And then the Iranians dragged the bodies of those service members through the streets. It was horrible. One bad thing after the next, one humiliation after another. We blamed Carter and we hated his weakness. And along came the movie actor Ronald Reagan, very much in the mode of John Wayne, and started running his mouth about how tough he was and how frightening he would be and how he would solve all these problems right away and the enemy would quake in their boots because of his toughness and his macho strength. And I bought it hook, line, and sinker. Again, I was a teenager. In the same way that Trump blusters and swaggers and tells people he's tough, Ronald Reagan told us he was tough. He said that the Iranians would be so scared that when he came into office, they would cough them up immediately, unharmed, and that they'd better do it because there would be a new sheriff in town. And lo and behold, on Inauguration Day in January of 1981, as soon as Ronald Reagan got done taking his oath of office, and they shook hands and kissed and did all the stuff they did to celebrate for a few minutes, he went right back up to the podium and said, The first American hostages were now landing in Germany and were free. And we all said, yes, that's what it is. That's peace through strength right there. That's Ronald Reagan. He scared them. And we bought that act hook, line, and sinker. But the truth was sordid and disgusting, just like the truth of Trump. He tells everybody how he got us out of wars. Well, he flat out surrendered us. He surrendered Iraq to ISIS. He surrendered Afghanistan to the Taliban, told them 11 months in advance the very day by which we would be out. And of course, he put it on Biden's watch. And the Trumpers buy that. But back to what happened, what really happened that we didn't know about in those days. Future members of the Reagan administration, private citizens, in violation of United States law, in violation of 200 years of American unity in dealing with foreign countries, traveled secretly and met with Iranian officials, and not only made a deal with them, they promised them weapons. But here was the key. The Iranians were not to release the hostages right away, because that could make Jimmy Carter look good. Very much like Trump and the border deal. Oh, don't fix it. I need to use this to bash Joe Biden. But Reagan was much more clever. We didn't know about this at the time. But these reprehensible individuals negotiated for the hostages not to be released, but to be retained by the Iranians until after the election. They didn't want what was called an October surprise. If you doubt any of this, look up October surprise. They wanted to make sure Carter didn't look good. They wanted the Iranians to wait until Reagan was elected. And then, tragically, the Iranians had very little understanding of our political system, and they thought they needed to wait until Inauguration Day itself. So those hostages that ended up suffering for 444 days suffered at the hands of Americans. I mean, quite literally, from October, November, December, and into January. The last 4 months of their ordeal was solely attributable to future Reagan administration officials, not one of whom has ever been brought to justice for it, as far as I know. And certainly, Ronald Reagan was never brought to justice for it. By the time this came out, he was in the final year of his 8 years, and he was he suffered so badly from Alzheimer's that everybody was sympathetic to him. He was wildly popular. Nobody did a thing about it. It was an embarrassing chapter that they wanted to put behind them. And just like the case of Trump, if our republic survives, this will be an embarrassing chapter that we want to put behind us. But let us not forget. We must not forget the con job, the lying, the treason, or the people who were foolishly duped by it, especially if they don't renounce their nonsense and their foolish ways, if they are not willing to admit, I was fooled. I was fooled by Reagan. I admit it. You've been fooled by Trump. It's way past time you people admitted it.
AIDS. It's literally all the comments said, and that's literally more than Reagan said his entire presidency about it the first go round. That part's not even a joke. I literally drank 2 full cups of black Colombian coffee this morning, and I've been trying to make sense of Ronald Reagan, but I think I got an easier way because this is an absolute nightmare, just like Roro was. Ronald Reagan literally falls into one of 8 categories in your life. I'm going to show you which ones real quick, and then we'll talk about AIDS. Health, homelessness, jail or incarceration, drugs, education, reasons why you're not rich, the earth is hot, and my personal favorite is mystery meat. It's literally just an others option. We're going to talk about the only thing that Nancy Reagan didn't put in her mouth today was AIDS. The AIDS crisis was identified in 1981. He was president. The first time he spoke about it was September 17th, 1985. Take a second and think about that. That silence cost so much, and we're going to touch on that in a second, but that created an increased stigma. So it was known as the gay plague, and he rode with that. He made this a very specific thing towards specific communities, and this was a targeted attack. He's always racially or somethingly motivated, if you will. This stigma created a cycle. People don't want to talk about it because they're listed in this group. This group doesn't want to go get tested, and when they do get tested, they don't want to face the stigmas publicly that are coming with this. So you literally create a self-fulfilling prophecy for these people, which is essentially a death sentence. The lack of a response not only touched the health category, but it touched drugs. So intravenous drugs were massive. We just didn't speak about this, so there's no initial response about AIDS or HIV transmission through intravenous drug use. People were sharing needles left and right. Now, it also folds into the mystery meat category because the silence itself exposed a giant hole in our crisis management system. Lack of public health awareness, and it also exposed a public bias by the president. Not like they didn't know that. Go look up what his running slogan was for president. Not only did this affect the community on an instant basis, but the long-term effects are massive. The health portion alone of this is insane. 40 million people with AIDS-related deaths since the beginning of this. 70,000 are just AIDS-specific, just died directly from the disease. In spaces where it directly affected and was so heavy, that's right, you guessed it, marginalized communities. If you didn't watch yesterday's video about how he directly affected the homeless population, take a look, because that increased homelessness means increased vulnerability of the population to the AIDS and HIV virus. Again, we're in a space and time where people are constantly sharing needles. The drug problem is rampant in the country. Don't trip, I'm gonna get to you later, Nancy Reagan, and your war on drugs. Bombastic side eye for you. Anyways, that created what we're gonna call a compound problem. It's literally like an exponent to its own issue. Something that did come out of it is harm reduction programs that are basically, at the time, were considerations, like the needle exchange. If you don't know what the needle exchange is, look it up. What an incredible program. The mystery meat portion of this, again, is going to be majorly based on the stigma behind it, right? This was geared towards and against homosexuals, for the most part. Stares in all affected, marginalized communities. I think there's also a social aspect to the mystery meat portion, to be honest, because once you assign somebody this social stigma, it's not like 1 or 2 generations just washes it out. Think about spilling something blood red on a white t-shirt. That metaphor was too on the nose for a Ronald Reagan video, wasn't it? America is the t-shirt. Ronald Reagan is the one who spilled the blood on it. What part of Reagan should we talk about tomorrow? Mom used to praise Reagan. I had no idea about Reaganomics until this video. Ronald Reagan literally kicked a bunch of homeless, mentally ill people out on the street, basically creating the homeless issue we see today with mental health. I was going to try and make sense of this, but instead I have a better option. Basically, Ronald Reagan falls into one of 8 categories in your life every day that you're being affected. Your health, homelessness, jail, drugs, education, reasons you're not rich, and the earth is hot. Also, mystery meat is kind of an other category. The ORBA Act is the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981. Ronald Reagan dropped this and not only destroyed instantly, but down the road. As it came out, it touched 4 points in people's lives. 1 was going to be your health, 2 is homelessness, 3 is jail, and then 4 is your literal pockets. Don't worry, it's still affecting categories today for you. Basically, Roro cut federal spending on mental health services. What he did is he converted the existing system to block grants and reduce state funding. That has an immediate reaction of closing psychiatric hospitals and reducing available inpatient care for severe mental health issues. Now, because this is creating an issue, it falls into the second category of homelessness. Not only did he do that, but he did so without setting up any community-based systems for the mentally ill. So if you were homeless before you went into a psychiatric facility or became homeless in one, figure it out. Which bleeds into incarceration rates. Because there's a lack of resources meant anybody who was mentally unwell had to end up in the system. Not anybody, but let's be honest. In these times, people weren't prioritizing mental health on a police call. Which leads to places like jail and prison having makeshift psychiatric wards, where they're just guessing and figuring stuff out. I'm sure they gave phenomenal care. Likely leading in the moment to reasons why you're not rich. So these federal cuts mean bigger financial burdens on states, local governments, and emergency services. They've got to get that money from somewhere, right? Not only that, but think about how this now has to have your money come from things in your area because you have to do it yourself on a state level. Your neighborhood is quite literally affected by a federal budget cut. Ronald couldn't stay in his lane, so he had to affect your future too. Like you're right now. So the ripple effect of this insanity is now the high cost of emergency care for psychiatric care. Again, this is versus the low cost of preventative care. So in order to get help, You're already damaged. It's more expensive, putting you in a financial burden to even get help that you need in the first place. Making it inaccessible to so many people. If you need health care and you don't get it, do you just get better? Now again, the ripple effect of this is, in a homeless sense, so many areas end up backlogged with things from the act that they've been playing catch up for years. Literally, we're 40 years plus and we're still playing catch up. This also puts us behind the curve on anybody who's homeless and experiencing a mental health issue. We're now inundated with years of things we could have learned prior to help people. Now, Mystery Me isn't just Nancy Reagan's favorite lollipop, it's also the failure to deinstitutionalize this. So there's calls for reform for mental health care systems, there's a focus on integrated and comprehensive approaches to treatment. This includes things like funding, in-care options, and services, all ironically pulled out in the very beginning, creating a full self-cycle of Reaganomics. Why do people on the right praise him so much? Tell me what sounds familiar. Aggressive anti-communism, economic policy, reduced welfare spending, military buildup, opposition to gun control, deregulation, law and order rhetoric, the war on drugs, opposition to abortion, anti-environmental policies, support for authoritarian leaders, opposition to gay rights, immigration raids and deportations, staunch anti-Soviet stance, rhetoric on moral decay, support for school prayer, opposition of affirmative action, reinforcement of the death penalty, appointment of conservative judges, resistance to union power, promotion of patriotism in schools, skepticism of the United Nations, criticism of the welfare queen stereotype, defense against apartheid in South Africa, Iran-Contra affair, reduced taxes for corporations, tight monetary policies, cuts to public housing funds, reinforcing the war on terror, promotion of American exceptionalism. Why do you hate Reagan so much? Riddle me this. We all know we're supposed to hate Roro, but do we know why? I think you would have appreciated that nickname. It'd be a 77-part series, but I'm going to give you the highlight reel here. If any of these things you don't understand what they are, just ask in the comments. Please be that person. We need more people who ask things when they're unsure. You hear the term Reaganomics a lot of that is about to be touched on. In 1981, we get the Economic Recovery Tax Act and the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. I'm going to kind of smush these together. So the first one is tax breaks, tax cuts for the wealthy, right? Because they need the money more than we do. Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act is truly some heinous stuff. It directly was social budget cuts against low-income areas. So we had things like Medicaid, public housing and community development, food stamps, educational programs, job training programs, and legal service counseling. We're just gutting. This man needed money to fund our government because we were in debt, / still are, shocker. So he decided to rip out these programs that were helping the poor. I don't know about you, but the wealth gap itself tells me this was directly aimed at a certain group of people. I digress. Do I? Because he immediately starts opposing the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Outwardly, publicly, as president. Opposing that. Opposing that! Like, think that through. While he was head of state, there was 2 major L's he took. One was his wife, the throat of state, and 2 was the war on drugs. He's quite literally lost the war on drugs every year since it occurred. Oro, if they have TikTok in hell, you lost. What does the war on drugs mean, right? There was increased federal funding, there were media campaigns, there were mandatory minimum sentencing, enhanced interdiction habits, coordination with foreign governments, and a focus on treatment and rehab. Called it a focus on treatment and rehab. I don't know about you, but when I think of 1980, I don't think that the government was out here really pushing that part. Coordinating with foreign governments, well, how did the dope get there? By the way, before I go, the increased federal funding and the media campaigns are pretty specific and pretty pointed. If you can pull up any information on that, your eyes will be as big as dinner plates. They won't, because how shocking is it at this point, right? Ronald Reagan. 1983 comes around, and remember those budgetary cuts and those tax breaks he was giving in 1981? Well, they really come back to bite him. You get a ripple effect here. Funny, these mosquito bloodsuckers only come out when I talk about Roro. Again, he outwardly starts to oppose the Voting Rights Act. Shocking. He has this ripple effect from his own policies, right? So you're starting to see, it's like if you just start taking engine parts out of the car and you're like, why isn't it going? That meme where they stick the stick in the spokes of their own bicycle and then they yell, why would you do this to me? Also in 1983, pretty specifically, he had some pretty heavy scrutiny and challenged affirmative action policies. specifically in education. Scholarships. He outwardly was like, no for scholarships. When I say scrutiny and challenge these things, I mean from a presidential level. Truly think about that. The president is outwardly scrutinizing these things. 1984 comes around. More of his old Reaganomics. Again, tax cuts for the super wealthy, because they still need it. They need that money. Reduction, again, in social programs. If you've already forgotten, we're talking about training. We're talking about food stamps. We're talking about housing. Reducing them further, because that's what got us where we are. There's a drop in civil rights enforcement. I don't know how else to phrase this. He basically saw civil rights, was supposed to enforce it, and was like, oops. Old Reagan, oops. Roe signed the Voting Rights Act. I just want to really put this out here. He reluctantly signed the Voting Rights Act, so I just like to imagine him signing it and be like, a little sassy signature. Also have the crime legislation that he pushed. So he had support and promotion of something called the Comprehensive Crime and Control Act. I'm going to read you just a little bit of this. I hate this man. So when they create an act, it's not just one rule that they make. So I'm going to touch on 4 pieces real quick. Sentencing guidelines, war on drugs enforcement, asset forfeiture, and bail and pretrial detention. All of these things were direct and specifically targeting the African American community, and I can explain that too. As far as sentencing guidelines go, this act created the U.S. Sentencing Commission. Now, what this commission did is they created a set of mandatory sentencing guidelines. The guidelines contributed to longer and more rigid sentences, reducing the judge's discretion to account for mitigating circumstances in individual cases. This standardized harsher penalties disproportionately affecting African Americans who were more likely to be convicted of crimes carrying mandatory minimum sentences. Again, this all touches each other. Watch. War on drugs enhancement. It was ramped up and continued after this act, but in 1984, the legislation included measures that intensified drug law enforcement. It increased penalties for drug offenses, which were more frequently prosecuted in African American communities, leading to higher incarceration rates among African Americans. Remember, it all touches. Asset forfeiture. The act expanded law enforcement's ability to seize assets believed to be connected to drug crimes prior to a conviction. Believed to be connected prior to a conviction. Believed. Practice often targeted lower-income individuals disproportionately, African Americans, sometimes depriving them of their property without due process. Without due process. Bail and pretrial detention. The law allowed for tougher bail conditions and pretrial detention for those accused of drug crimes, again, affecting African Americans who were less likely to afford bail, thereby increasing pretrial incarceration rates in this demographic. So you asked why I hate Roe so much, and to be honest, this is just a highlight reel of 4 years. Why do you hate him? Lastly, before I go, somebody reached out and told me that their 14-year-old son watches these videos. The user's name was Himothy. I don't know what his son's was. But you're 14 years old and you have an interest in the truth, and I definitely think that you're cool for that. So shout out to you. I hate Ronald Reagan. I almost forgot a bonus fact for you. Ronald Reagan tipped off his presidential campaign in the town of Philadelphia, Mississippi. It's where Mississippi burning happened. Seems like a warning shot now.